Well, welcome today to the Struggle Well podcast. My name is Ken Falke. I'm the host today, and we've got a very special guest with Gary Sinise, a very special guest, a very special friend, and a guy doing some amazing work with veterans, especially those that have been catastrophically wounded. And just want to welcome you, Gary, to the show today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Ken. Good to be with you.
Well, it's funny. I was going through my phone, Gary, the other day, and I found those two pictures of us here together at Boulder Crest in Virginia. And then I also was digging through my camera and I found the picture of the first time we met, which was at that GE panel, which I'll text you later. It's a great picture.
Please send me that picture. Yeah.
Neither of us have gray hair.
No, well, it was a while ago. You know, I was actually looking to see if I could find a picture from that event, and I don't have it, so please send it to me.
I will text it to you. Well, thank you for being here. I've got just a handful of questions. I thought we'd keep it casual and just and kind of go through some of the stuff that we've put together and ask everybody and tie it into the science of post-traumatic growth, which is what we work on here at Boulder Crest and what Struggle Well is really all about. So I'll jump into them. I think maybe before I jump into the first question, I will tell everybody how we kind of met, and feel free to jump in and tell them. But Gary and I was asked to sit on a panel for hiring veterans with GE back in 2013, and Gary was the moderator for that panel. And afterwards, I talked to Gary, and we shared phone numbers and email addresses. And a few months later, I got a text that said, "Hey, I'm in Virginia. Can I come visit Boulder Crest Retreat, Virginia?" And I said, "Yeah, we'd love to have you." And you and your beautiful wife showed up, and we had a great day together. So I think that's it. And then a couple of years later, you called me and said, "Hey, I've got."
What?
Go ahead.
Wait a minute. Let me just didn't Boulder Crest open in 2012?
I'm sorry. No, we opened in September of 13.
September 13. Okay.
September,
so yeah,
came in August of 13.
That's right. But when I visited, you were still building it.
We were.
So it wasn't even open yet. So I remember when I came, I was doing. I was at 8th and I for the ceremony there. It was like the final ceremony of the summer at 8th and I with the Marines. And it was at the end of August. So it was probably, maybe a week or two before you opened that I came there. You were still putting the finishing touches on the cabins and all that stuff.
Well, the grand opening day, not everybody knows this, but the grand opening day, we actually had wet paint on the lodge. So it was right down to the wire.
Don't touch the paint.
Yeah. So, and then a couple years later, after you had a meeting with Jim Sursley from DAV, we talked about partnering and doing a program for the guys and gals you were building homes for, and we do that still today, which is our Warrior Path program, and it's been a great partnership between Boulder Crest and the Gary Sinise Foundation, and just want to thank you personally for that.
Oh, thank you. No, we met at the right time, because we were looking for something to extend beyond our home building efforts for our wounded. We wanted to continue to serve these particular wounded service members that we were building these houses for, beyond just building them the house and then handing it over and then waving, And so we want to stay actively involved in their lives. So the initial program was designed to offer this opportunity to come to Boulder Crest to the folks that we were building these houses for. And so the timing was perfect, Ken, when we met at the GE event.
And it was when we first met Jim Sursley, it was amazing, because we talk about post-traumatic growth, and here was a triple amputee living, 70 years old, living with these injuries for nearly 40 years, who had gone on to do these remarkable things in his life, and telling us the stories of carrying shingles up on roofs as a young guy right out of Vietnam, and then getting into the business that he's in today. But what an inspiration and what a great mentor to these young guys.
Yeah, and that was I've had a really strong, positive, productive, wonderful relationship with the DAV, the Disabled American Veterans, since I played Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, and that goes back to the mid '90s. So I know many of these folks for a number of years, and so the idea was, having known so many from the Vietnam era and other conflicts, decades old, who have survived their injuries, gone on to thrive. They struggle very well and have done really remarkable things in their careers. And then this new generation of real life Lieutenant Dans coming from the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts, who are just starting to deal with the lifelong issues that they will face, the challenges that they will face because of their injury. The idea was, what if we pair them up with somebody like Jim Searsley and somebody like Richard Marbs and some of the other folks that have been a part of the DAV for many, many years, who have gone on and lived with their injuries for a number of years. And it seemed to be a very good idea to get some of those guys together with some of these younger guys. And I think it's proved to be very, very positive, and certainly them all attending the PATH program at Boulder Crest and everything, spending all that time together. They really bond, they learn a lot from each other. And these older veterans who have been struggling well for a long time and overcome the seriousness of their injuries and gone on to thrive in their lives, doing wonderful things. That's inspirational and motivational for these young folks, I think. Gives them a lot of hope looking forward.
Yeah, no, it definitely is amazing. And it's great to watch it here too, and just see it. Because I often wonder, when they're young, it's easy to, not easy by any means, but it's easier to walk on their prosthetic legs. It's to manipulate these arms. And as you get older and you get heavier, I mean, there's all these questions I think that people have. What does the future of my life look like? So to see this positivity and right in front of them, and guys that have been very, very successful in many measurable ways, I think it really does create hope.
Yeah, like I'm going to be okay. I mean, if he can do it, I can do it. He's missing 3 limbs. I'm missing 3 limbs. He's gone on to be successful in business and have a wonderful career. That's the story of Lieutenant Dan. It's the story we want. He's catastrophically injured. He suffers. He goes through anguish and pain and despair, and in the end, he's standing up again. He's moving forward. He's successful in business, and he's able to put the war years, take the war years, and put them over here now. We put them behind. We move on. We're dealing with our lives today, not yesterday, and moving forward, and seeing actual veterans who have done that. These real life Lieutenant Dans is very positive for a lot of our young folks. Yeah. I remember, the story of Brendan Morocco.
Sure.
And Brian Anderson.
Yep.
So I tell a story in my book about a Grateful American, about Brendan. And Brendan was the first to survive a bombing in Iraq, where he survived quadruple amputation back in 2009. April of 2009, he was injured, blown up, lost his arms, lost his legs. I saw him about 2 weeks after he arrived at Walter Reed. His mom was there. He was very heavily medicated at that time. So I don't even know if Brendan even remembers that I was there, but his mom did. And I spent a lot of time with his mom. And I remember, so this is 2009. Brian Anderson, a triple amputee, had been injured in 05, 06, that period, and I met him right around there. So Brian and he's from Illinois. We met in the MATSE, he was working on his prosthetics, and we just became pals and stayed in touch. And here we are in 2009, and I just meet Brendan in the hospital, and he's missing both his arms and both his legs. He was the first to survive that in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict. And I remember leaving the hospital, driving away from the hospital after meeting Brendan, and calling Brian on the phone and saying, Brian, I just met Brendan, this young soldier, Brendan Morocco. He lost both his arms, both his legs. Brian is a triple amputee, still got one arm. And I said, do you think you could, he was in Pennsylvania at the time. I said, do you think you could come to Washington and just meet him and spend some time with him? Because Brian is, you know Brian, I mean, he lost both his legs and an arm, and he's like a gymnast anyway. I mean, he's just nonstop, inspirational guy, wrote a book, busy with all the time. He's traveling here and traveling there, and he's doing all kinds of things. And he really, at that time, 2009, he'd really begun to live with his injury and to accept it and make the most of it. And he's got one arm, that's it. And now we have somebody who's missing all four limbs. And Brian's a triple amputee. I said, there's nobody you could talk to, who's lost all four limbs, but can you go there and talk to him and spend some time with him? And so Brian went up and spent 3 or 4 days in the hospital, just coming in, talking to Brendan, spending time showing Brendan that there's life after the injury, that he could move forward. And I think that was very, very helpful at the time for Brendan, early in his injury. So he's still got some post-traumatic stress there. I mean, there's still a lot going on there. But I think just having Brian come in there and being so positive and living his life and moving forward. They went out to dinner. They got Brendan out of the hospital. And I think it was very positive. And I wrote about that in the book because like we say, we at Boulder Crest and Gary Sinise Foundation and DAV, we pair up our younger veterans with some of the older veterans that have been living with these injuries for a while. And it can be very positive to see somebody living their life, even though they've been catastrophically injured in such a way.
No, it's crazy. I broke my back. I don't know if I've ever had this conversation with you, but I broke my back in a parachute jump in 1989, and I was told my career was over, and I guess no way could compare to an amputation by any means. But I remember being in that hospital and thinking, "There's no way my career is over. This is all I know. It's all I want to be," and you just kind of muscle through it to do whatever you can to get back to where you want to be. But Julie and I started, I retired from the Navy in 2002. We started the EOD Warrior Foundation in 2004. And big news this week, I'm no longer the chairman. My terms have all expired. And, unlike Boulder Crest, where I have a lifetime appointment here, but with the EOD Warrior Foundation, we had merged an old legacy EOD Foundation with a new one, what we started, the Wounded EOD Warrior Foundation. And many of the young wounded EOD guys you've built homes for, Taylor Morris being the war's 5th quadruple amputee. But Tim Brown, I don't know if you know Tim or have ever met him. Tim's a Marine triple amputee.
Yeah, I know Tim.
Tim did the same thing. He as soon as he could get out into a wheelchair, he was going from bed to bed telling guys, it's okay, we're going to get through this. And it was, I remember it. I mean, it brought tears in my eyes. It was so inspirational.
Yeah, and they can that can really lift you up. You're missing both your legs, and somebody walks in missing both his legs and both his arms, and he says, "Hey, you're going to be all right." You listen.
Yeah. I took Taylor Morris out to Cal Poly. He wanted to get a special project done on his legs that his prosthesist couldn't do, and the students at Cal Poly were going to do this for him. We got to Cal Poly. Nobody knew he was coming with the exception of several, maybe 10 students. But they had a sign up at Cal Poly. I'll send you the picture. It's hilarious. And it says, the price of gas will cost you an arm and a leg. And he went over and stood in front of that, with his prosthetic on. And I'm thinking he said, take my picture. And I'm like, okay, I will, but I'm not sure it's not funny to me, but if it's funny to you, that's.
He's got a good sense of humor.
He does. Great young man. And they're getting ready to have a baby. I don't know if you've seen the news.
Yeah, fantastic. It's
so exciting.
I haven't seen their house yet, but they're very happy. We built so many houses. I mean, there's just I haven't been able to see most of it. But
we flew out for the wedding, and he showed us the lot that they wanted. This is because it was a big negotiation they had to have, and
by the river there.
Yeah, we never got to see that. We haven't seen the house yet. We will one day, but we went to the wedding and just to see him walk down the aisle was just unbelievable.
Oh, pretty awesome. And now they're having a baby, which is really good. They seem to be doing very well. Sure.
They are, yeah. Danielle's doing really well.
Happy for them.
Well, I wrote a couple questions down, Gary. I just want to kind of go through because I think it'll help with the audience that's listening. We try to talk to all our guests about, personal stories, not other people's stories, but in your stories. And I just wondered if there's anything, that I always tell people, I think my broken back was probably a defining moment in my life that kind of got me going, but just from a pure personal struggle perspective to get to where you became this famous actor and super guy. I mean, what anything that you can remember, any stories you'd share that you remember growing up that could have really had an impact on the way you changed the perspective maybe in your life?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a lot of different things, different people that I've met along the way that have, inspired or educated or motivated me. Certainly, I've had in my book, I started to write about the post 9/11 period where I really I made a hard turn toward service work for our veterans and everything. But then I thought, well, I think what'll make this even more interesting is not just all these things that have happened since then, but how did I get to the place where I would turn kind of toward service? And there were many, many different things that happened along the way, and folks that I met, veterans. I've got veterans in my own family and veterans on my wife's side, Vietnam veterans on my wife's side. They probably had more of an influence on me than the veterans in my own family, because the veterans in my own family, by the time I was old enough to kind of, even absorb anything that they might have to say about their service years, they were well beyond those years. And so my grandfather, my uncles, my dad, I mean, none of them ever talked about their service years when I was a kid.
Right.
And I remember my grandfather, who was a World War I veteran. I just as a little guy, we've all heard the stories about finding the trunk full of stuff, and I remember doing the exact same thing, finding my grandfather's World War I uniform and different things like that. But as a kid, I never even asked him what it was, or what did you do, or any of that. And then, by the time I was old enough and kind of to deal with that, he had passed away, and my uncles, I did spend some time with my Uncle Jack, who was a World War II veteran. My Uncle Jerry passed away, unfortunately, in 96, but my Uncle Jack, the oldest of the three brothers, my dad and his two brothers, the oldest was Uncle Jack, and he passed away at 90 years old. So I actually spent quite a number of years with him, talking to him about a lot of his service years in a B-17 and what it was like to go up there, mission after mission, and get, the sky was falling out and planes were going down everywhere, and difficult stuff. He would only go so far as to talk about, I would get him to go so far, and then he wouldn't go, and he saw a lot of bad stuff. But then when I met my wife, Ken, she introduced me to her brothers, and they are Vietnam veterans. One is still alive. The other one passed away years ago. And her wife and her sister, who was in the Army, married a Vietnam veteran who was in the Army for about 22 years, combat medic. And I think it was the Vietnam veteran side of my family that sort of started me waking up a bit. I talk about that quite a bit in the book, because it was initial, early, wait a minute, while I was in high school chasing girls around and playing rock and roll and doing high school theater plays, these guys were just a little bit older than me, and they were over in the jungle and they were getting shot at. And then they came home and the whole world turned its back on them here. And they struggled, you know. There were two brothers in my wife had two brothers. One was the oldest, went to West Point, served 2 tours in Vietnam, went on, he would have been a general, I have no doubt. He was a very, very highly regarded military man, West Point graduate. In fact, 2 of our 4-star generals that recently retired, Mike Scaparrotti and General Vince Brooks, my brother-in-law taught them. He was their TAC officer.
Wow.
And that's why I stayed so close with Mike and Vince, because when we met, I said that Boyd McCanna Harris was my brother-in-law, and they just went nuts, and they started talking about him and everything. He unfortunately passed away when he was a lieutenant colonel while he was teaching at Fort Leavenworth. But, you know, in the short time I knew him, he made a gigantic impression on me. He stayed in the Army. The youngest of the 2 brothers, his younger brother, joined the Army, was a helicopter pilot. He came back and got out of the Army. And I think the fact that he left the service, it was even harder for guys that came back from Vietnam and then got out of the service than it was for the guys that stayed in the service. They were still surrounded by other guys who had been to Vietnam. So they had this community of veterans around them, whereas so many of the other guys came out, got out of the service and went back to their towns, and they had to disappear into the shadows and hide, because being a Vietnam veteran was not a good thing at that time. So I learned quite a bit from them back in the early 80s, and those moments really planted some strong seeds that would take root later on, when I actually played a Vietnam veteran in Forrest Gump and started engaging with our wounded because of that movie. And those were the fundamental things that kind of laid the foundation for a full turn to service post 9/11. In fact, the chapter in my book that talks specifically about that, the title of the chapter is Turning Point. And that moment, you know, for many folks, but certainly for me, the moment of devastation on September 11, 2001, really, life was never the same after that.
Yeah, none of ours were, that's for sure. It's definitely changed the way everything happens. And I think, you know, even now today, COVID-19's changing it again. So, and this is what struggle's about. And this is what we tell people all the time, is that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And no matter who we are in life, we live a series of these ups and downs, and the best way to get through, and we call it kind of the livable band, is to have, you know, great people around you, these mentors and friends that you can turn to when times are tough, but also to be able to self-regulate. And that was one thing. I grew up with a World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam War grandfather. He was in 3 wars and a career soldier, hard as nails, you know, but he drank a lot. He was abusive. It wasn't a nice, you know, when he was sober, it was a great guy to be around. When he was drunk, it was just a terrible way. But that's the way a lot of these guys dealt with, you know, their invisible injuries. And that's really what we hope, you know, programs like Warrior Path and partnerships like ours can solve, is these guys sitting at the bar all day trying to drown their sorrows, when really they should be. I tell young soldiers all the time, come home from war and become the productive members of society here that you were on the battlefield, and
Absolutely.
be that great citizen. And that's really what we hope to do.
Sometimes they just need the tools and the guidance and the motivation to see beyond those days, and it's very difficult for many of them.
It's very difficult. You mentioned your family not talking about the war. As a young kid, I think I was 16 and 17, on Saturdays, I used to deliver and pick up furniture for an upholstery company here in Alexandria, Virginia, Abbott's Upholstery. And the two guys that own it were characters from North Carolina, furniture makers, super guys, drank a lot, played guitar, and did all the great things that, kind of old country bumpkin guys from North Carolina would do. And I knew they were both in the service because they saw my life not doing very well and thought that, the service would be good for me. And they used to say it all the time. And I knew one was a Marine and one was a soldier. What I didn't know until I retired from the Navy and was getting my car serviced was that one of the brothers was the lead rescuer for the people that were in the Bataan death camps. He was an Army Ranger, Silver Star.
No.
Never talked about it. Never talked about it.
I've got the Ghost Soldiers book up here on my shelf.
Look in the book, Vernon Abbott. He's holding a prisoner of war in the book. And this was a guy. God. He was a guy who was my childhood mentor, and they made a movie out of him. He's a hero in the movie and a hero in the book. And
they made The Great Raid. Yeah.
The Great Raid. Yeah.
I was almost in. There was another version of that. They were going to make the Ghost Soldiers as a television show for ABC, and I was negotiating to play the Colonel, and Harvey Weinstein was the one who made The Great Raid, and Harvey Weinstein was about to start shooting The Great Raid in Australia, and he heard about this ABC project on Ghost Soldiers, and he called up ABC and put the muscle on him or something. Next thing I know, I'm getting a call. Well, they're not going to do the project anymore.
Well, I looked this guy up, and you can find the book on your shelf. It was an amazing story. I reconnected. He passed away. I actually got to go meet with him and have a coffee, and he remembered me as a young kid. It had been 30 years since we'd seen each other. But I reconnected with his daughter a few years ago because one of the guys that works for us at Boulder Crest was doing the death march that they do out in White Sands, New Mexico every year.
Yeah.
And we got a 20-pound steel plate with the picture that's in Ghost Soldiers with Vern carrying this prisoner of war. We got it superimposed on this steel plate, and he carried it in his rucksack for the walk. So that was our tribute back to him because he was such an amazing character and very influential in my life.
There's certainly no shortage of stories from World War II that just make you shake your head and go, how did people survive certain things?
And Vietnam. I watched a movie which I'll never remember the other night with my wife Julia. We watched the story of Airman Pitzenberger, who was a Medal of Honor recipient, but he got his medal 30 years after the incident.
That's a recent film that just came out.
Yeah, it's on pay-per-view, but it's really, really good. And a story of how his teammates, the people whose lives he saved, had spent the 30 years of their lives fighting to get this Medal of Honor, upgraded Air Force Cross to a Medal of Honor. Amazing story. Very, very well done movie. Well, speaking of movies, you mentioned Forrest Gump, and Julie and I have been out to your museum a couple times now and sat on the bench and held the box of chocolates, and I know that was a turning point, but what a great job on that to honor yourself and your service. Rich Tedeschi, who is the doctor from the University of North Carolina who coined this term post-traumatic growth, he's a clinical psychologist. He feels and has witnessed to over 40 years of research that the epitome of post-traumatic growth is really becoming this expert guide, helping people through the journey after your journeys of struggle. And Gary, I think, that's exactly what you are. I've read your book. I was honored. A friend of mine, before I even read your book, to find out that my name was in your book. You know, I'm just honored by your friendship. I'm honored by what you do for all of our veterans. And I think I said this years ago. I met these two young girls who were raising money for veterans, and we were doing a big fundraising event, and I brought them up on stage, and I said, it's easy, I think, for people to look at guys like me and say, you know, he served, his brothers were wounded or killed in action. There's a reason he's doing what he's doing. But you know, it's not as easy to look at people who haven't been in uniform to do it. And I just want to say, really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for what you do, because it is hard sometimes for people to do it. And I know for you, it wasn't just about a movie, but thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that, but and I'm so proud of our partnership, and God put us together that day, and GE had something to do with it too, but so that we could do some good things. And I was so impressed with what you wanted to do with your success. And you know, you've done well post-service years and all of that, and you saw a need, and you said, I'm going to try to fill that need, and I've done well. And I'm gonna do something with that success, and I understand that feeling. I've feel blessed to have been able to learn some lines and spit them out well enough that I can make a living at it, and to do something with it. It makes it all, you know, meaningful, and so much more meaningful to be able to do something with the success that you've had to help other people.
Yeah. Well, the only other thing I wanted to say, Gary, is I've been in your office a few times, and I always notice there's a Navy Chief Petty Officer's hat and in a box, and I'm a retired Master Chief. And you told me, whether you want to admit to this or not, that was one of the best gifts you'd ever been given, was to become an honorary Chief Petty Officer. So I want to end this podcast by just saying, go Navy, beat Army.
I don't want to get in trouble with all my Army pals now, but you bet. Thank you.